Okay, I am excited about this call. We have on the line Jacob, pronouns are he, him, and he's going to ask about the argument that gender is a neurochemical phenomena rather than a social construct. So let's go ahead and bring Jacob on. Jacob, are you there? Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hey, welcome to the
Yes.
show.
Yeah,
Yeah,
welcome
so
back.
walk
Actually,
us
this
through
is
your
my third
question.
time,
Hmm.
in a row. I guess I'm kind of addicted to y'all. Anyways, um,
Excellent. Well, we're glad to have you. What do you want to talk about?
so yeah, basically, I try to be a skeptic, and so I try to look at evidence-based things. And I recently saw the Professor Dave's video. I don't know if y'all have seen it. Basically describing what I asked about, that he claims that it's gender roles that are social constructs, and that gender is in fact just something that happens in the brain. And I just I don't know. He seems to have evidence behind this claim, but I don't know if it's the most evidence possible or if there's something else that has more evidence.
Yeah,
I
I
just
don't
wondered
think it's
what
it's
y'all
an
thought.
either or. That if I can quote rebut anything, it's the notion that gender is entirely determined by neurochemicals. I mean, first of all, I'm just going to dismiss out of hand the idea that something is insignificant because it quote only happens in the brain. I mean, math only happens
Mhm.
in the brain. Like the
I didn't.
idea of like national sovereignty, the United States of America is just a imaginary construct that we all somehow hold in our brains, even though none of us can
I
touch
said
it.
it was
And so,
insignificant. That was me misspeaking. Sorry.
yeah, and I don't, and I'm certainly not meaning to tear you down. I didn't mean to suggest that you had, but it's a thought, right?
Mhm.
That somehow our gender ideas are silly because they were trying to like override some hardwired foundational aspect, fundamental aspect of our identity. But anyway, to try and address the question, I would say that yeah, there are significant biological underpinnings to gender. We talked to student Dr. Ben about this idea. We've talked to a number of different people from all kinds of disciplines about the genetics, the hormones, the like underlying biological mechanisms
Mhm.
of gender, and they're real and they matter, but they are not a complete picture for a lot of reasons. I mean, it is kind of silly in this day and age when we are still having questions about nature versus nurture, and this
Mhm.
idea that our bodies are one way but our brains are different, or our culture is different. It's all working together. All of these things are constantly working in tandem. The environment that we are in, the ideas that we are introduced to, are going to have meaningful impacts, not just on the way that we interpret the chemical transmitters and the things going on inside of our bodies, but also the way that those processes operate. There is such a lack of concordance genetically in these things. What we see in the petri dish and what we understand when we like sequence somebody's genome is not going to account for everything. There's so much that comes from the culture that we live in, and that's why when we look at different societies across Earth and across history, we see so many different understandings of gender. If this was all
Mhm.
purely hardwired, you would think that we would all more or less come to the same conclusions, and that's very much not the case across time and history. But I'm going on when I know that both of you folks have a lot of interesting ideas on this. So what comes to mind, Laura and Kara?
Yeah, so I would love to follow on with what you were saying, Christy, about how you really can't draw this bright line between this is biology and this is culture or society. They are always going to be interacting, and like you mentioned, if it were hardwired, then why are we having this conversation? And that's kind of what I go back to whenever people try to say, well, gender is immutable. It's exactly the same as your biological sex, and biology
Oh,
says so, and that's it, and that's all.
oh
And
no,
if
no.
that were the case, then no one would be deviating from that.
Sorry.
Right?
That's
um
real quickly, can I say something?
Yes,
yeah.
That's not
please.
what me or the video is saying. It's saying basically, sorry, I should have described it better, that, like, for example, a trans woman's, he mentioned certain, the actual chemical name, but I can't remember it right now. Basically, that they line up with a cis woman much more than they would line up with a cis man for a trans woman. So basically that it's not one-to-one. You know, you can still be trans. He's not a transphobe, but yeah.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Laura.
and
Did I
no, that
talk over
there
you?
are studies that indicate that if we could totally isolate and identify the quote gender parts of your brain or of your genetics, then yeah, we would see that concordance in the places where we are able to look at brains and understand what's going on, quote, gender wise. We see a lot of that kind of concordance. And I'll go ahead and tell you, Jacob, I have documented that pretty well on my website, and I can make sure to post some links on the Secular Sexuality Facebook fan group about this topic, because it's something we've addressed on this show in detail before. But to just draw a line underneath it, I think it's important to remember that even as we start to study and explore these things and we start to understand, well, where is gender coming from and why, that we not get to this place where we say, oh, well, because I can see it in the scan, or, oh, because it shows up in this test tube, now I validate your experience, or now I agree with, quote, how you feel about your gender. We need to couch all of this in a philosophy of validating people's identities, of recognizing that people are who they say that they are, and that it is their right to have the body and the experience that they have. I know you're not advocating against any of that, Jacob, but I just wanted to make sure to undergird this entire conversation in a curiosity that isn't prescriptive, right? That none of us get to sit here and say, well, because we understand that gender is this under a microscope, that everybody needs to work within or operate with those specific ideas.
Yeah, and I want to recommend another article too, Christy, that
Mm-hmm.
kind of speaks to that same thing. This idea that we kind of all agree, okay, nature versus nurture. That's sort of a false dichotomy. They're both going to be involved, but also we tend to kind of forget sometimes that even when we're doing the hard sciences and we're looking in a microscope, we're looking through our own kind of gendered perspectives and experiences and maybe bringing biases to that that we are not aware of. And there's a really interesting article that I love by Emily Martin called "The Egg and the Sperm: How Science Has Constructed a Romance Based on Stereotypical Male-Female Roles." And it's really interesting. It's an older article. This is from the 90s, but kind of the points that she makes in it are that even when we're talking about what is biology as compared to what is culture, we're talking about biology within the culture that we live in through the lens and the biases that we brought to it. And she kind of makes points like, okay, think about when you learned in sex ed or basic biology about a sperm fertilizing an egg. Why is it the case that we always describe the egg as the passive recipient of the sperm, rather than you always have this kind of story about there's this horde of sperms that are competing and racing against one another to see who can get to the egg first, and we're kind of giving them this sort of masculine athletic sort of warrior style
Yeah, we think of it like
description.
survival of the fittest. Like the fittest
Yeah,
sperm is the one that will end up impregnating the egg.
yeah,
I think you're
and the
about to
egg
tell
is
us, Kara,
just
that's not the
sitting there.
case.
That's not the case. The egg actually participates in, absorbing the sperm
Selecting.
and
Mm-hmm.
selecting, yes. But we've kind of accidentally probably overlaid these gendered stereotypes about men and women on top of the sperm and the egg, and it sneaks in there. And now we think we're learning science and biology, but we're also learning about the way that we as a society tends to think about and describe men and women. So it kind of all gets mixed up together. And there's several other examples like that in there. I just think it's a really fun read if you're interested in that kind of thing,
Hmm.
to step back and say, hey, you know what? Maybe I need to take several steps back and think about all of the assumptions that might have come into what I know about this. And it sounds like that's something that you're kind of talking about too, with the whole neurochemical stuff, which I haven't read
Yeah,
either,
that's
but it
Yeah, and
sounds
I'll
really
make
interesting.
sure
interesting.
to
I
have
pulled up
that
an
article
article.
available to everybody again in the Facebook fan group. But Jacob, how is any of this resonating for you? How are we answering or not answering that central question?
That was helpful. I have that article pulled up, and I'll read that. So thank you. I do have another quick question, if that's good, if it's all right.
Sure.
Yeah, walk us through it.
So basically, Laura mentioned it earlier, and I'm sure you guys might be tired of hearing it, or maybe not. I don't know. But what do you all think the differences between bisexual and pansexual is? Because I'm not sure what to call
Mm.
myself. Or is there a difference? Are they the same term?
I
So
think
I
we
would
did an
love,
entire episode on this topic at one point. I wonder if I
Oh,
can't
did
pull
you?
that
Okay.
up. But in the meantime, yeah, Laura, what are your thoughts here?
yeah, I would love to take a stab at this because this is something that I'm just learning. I didn't even identify with the label pan until I took an anthropology class on sex and gender. And one thing that's really, really, really important to understand is that words are descriptive, not prescriptive, and that especially in terms of the LGBTQ community and sexuality and gender, that a lot of these terms are new and being tossed around and played with. And so there's a lot of argument. Like when I started identifying with pan, I didn't even realize that I could be offending people who identify simply as bi because it suggests that if you're a bi person, you may not be attracted to trans men or trans women, which may or may not be the case. And so a lot of bi people were getting somewhat offended that, well, that's already covered under the bi umbrella. So they can be interchangeable depending on who you ask, and they can be both used together depending on who you ask. But it's really like it's actually kind of vehemently debated in a lot of the LGBT circles that I have a lot of online
Yeah.
discussions with.
Hmm.
Oh, and so one thing that I've found that helps me in terms of bi versus pan is bi. The way that it was described to me that I thought was the most pleasing was you're attracted to your own gender and other genders, and so that covers like anything and everything, right? Whereas pansexual is more I'm attracted to people regardless of their genitals. Like the genitals are not the most important thing in terms of attraction. And now those are the definitions that I've personally adopted because I like them. But if
Mm.
you ask another bi person or another pan person or bi pan person, you're going to get different answers depending on their understanding. Like all of this is just so new and rapidly evolving. But I would love to hear Christy and Kara's thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll suppose I'll just jump in very quickly and say that the crux of the conversation we had in the past was really came down to who are we talking to? You know, if
Hmm.
we imagine that these words don't matter except for their capacity to transmit a idea, in this case, that idea is your sexual orientation to another person, then what is the easiest, simplest series of just mouth sounds that you can create? Like, how do you push air out of your diaphragm in such a way as to communicate a idea from one brain to another? And that's going to depend a little bit on who you're talking to, because if you are trying to describe your sexuality to your grandmother, her
Hmm.
notion of bisexuality is probably going to be different than some of the definitions that Laura just gave. So,
Right.
in many, many, many cases, people who identify as pansexual will sort of shorten it to bi as a way of just fitting into a paradigm that other people can understand. And sure, we can have really complex discussions about how that may lead to erasure or misunderstanding, but the sad, unfortunate reality is that we all have to exist in this very messy, undereducated world that we've created for ourselves. And this language around our sexual orientation is very new, and we're not very good at it yet. Just as a human
Right.
species, we are underdeveloped in our technological ability to use language to discuss sexuality. And that's something we're all going to have to cope with. So ultimately, Jacob, I would say that whatever word you use may change year to year, may change conversation to conversation or person you're talking to. And you don't need to get overly hung up on it, even as
Right.
you're trying to operate, respectfully and mindfully.
One thing I would add is don't be afraid to, or be ready to give a little bit of context or explanation. Like if you say, "Oh, I'm bisexual," and someone was like, "What does that mean?" Be willing to kind of open up and have that bigger discussion because we all want to describe things in ways that are pithy and that communicate the most amount of information in as few words as possible. But when you have all these nuances, that's not always possible. So sometimes it is going to take a little bit of maybe uncomfortable misunderstandings or a little bit of additional context or explanation. So I don't know. I don't know if that helps or not, but
Yeah. Okay. Thank y'all.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Thanks. Was
yeah.
that it?
I think that's good for me. So have a good night, guys.
Hey,
Okay, great.
appreciate
Thanks
you.
so much for
Take
calling,
care.
Jacob.